Hi, I'm George and welcome to part 42 of the Horizon series. This week we assemble the booster, we do a wet dress rehearsal, and we also paint it. So let's get started. So here's the final release head for the booster. Up here we've got that primary lever. Here's the secondary one and the tertiary one that the servo is connected to that releases it. Basically releases it like this. That comes down, that goes up. Now you'll see these have been added. This is to prevent these levers from moving too far out where they could potentially catch on the booster, those bottom brackets, so that prevents that from happening. So now we need to mount this to the rest of the launcher. This is the base plate that the release head fits into. It's sitting on 4 stainless steel bolts that allow us to make fine adjustments so that we can exactly align the release mechanism with the booster. We thread the high pressure hose through the base plate. This supplies the air to the second stage. The whole thing can then be screwed in. The full hold down force goes through this tapered thread. And here it is next to the 1010 rail with the back rail for extra rigidity. You'll notice that we have coloured tape next to a lot of the bolts on the launcher. This makes it a lot easier to identify which spanner to grab out in the field. Just jumping in here quickly while editing, you may not be aware, but YouTube has this great new feature where it auto dubs this video into other languages. So if you want to hear it in a select number of languages, just go down into your settings. Then choose audio track, and then finally the language you want to listen to.
Qui est vraiment bien. Maintenant, pour ce qui est de l'ordinateur de vol de la fusée, c'est le premier à avoir déployé le moteur de servomoteur trop.
Er verfügt über eine Open-Source-Software, sodass wir möglicherweise versuchen können, zu analysieren, was passiert ist, und es möglicherweise
e incluso arreglarlo, pero eso requeriría toda una campaña de pruebas.
Okay, so let's get back to the video. Before we glue the booster segments together, we sand them, as it's a lot easier to do that now than after it's all glued together. We use 120 grit wet sanding to keep the dust down. The first thing we need to attach is the central bracket, but in order to do that, we need to know how far up the booster it needs to go. So we strap the segments together and position them relative to the release head and where the nozzle seats will be. With the base plate adjustment, we have about 10 millimeters that we can go up and down to do the final adjustment after the bracket is glued in place. Here we've marked out the locations where the bracket pads will sit. And of course, just prior to gluing, we give them a good sand. We're using the 24-hour epoxy to glue the brackets on. We decided to glue 2 of the booster segments at the same time to the bracket, but this was a little bit more tricky than we initially expected, as you basically had too many moving parts to keep everything aligned. Next time, we would glue 1 of them at a time. We added the third booster segment while the glue cured for the first 2 to make sure that the entire booster was all aligned. Here we added a couple of angle brackets across the 2 booster segments that have been glued so that we could see if there was any twist in the booster. As you can see, these seem to be pretty well aligned. The next day, we can glue in the third booster segment. This was much more straightforward, as all we had to do was drop it on top. At the end here, we have the original spacer to make sure that the top of the booster has the right spacing. The next day we can attach the bottom brackets that we made back in episode 36. These were fairly straightforward to attach to the booster. After marking out their locations, we masked them off and gave them a good sand again. No guessing what type of glue we used here, of course. The bracket then gets weighed down to squeeze out excess glue. The next day we can do the next bracket. We give everything a thick coat of glue. I don't know how many litres of this glue we've used over the years. Skewer sticks are my weapon of choice to both apply and clean up epoxy. I find you have a lot of control with them. The joints then get covered with electrical tape. The tape nicely conforms to the edges, so we end up with nice smooth fillets. No, it's not some magic epoxy curing tape. Here we are 12 hours later, and you can see how well it created the fillets around the joints. Now it's time to attach the top ring we made back in episode 38. We need to glue this on all at the same time. To do that, we have to thread the ring from the top, but so we don't scrape the glue off, we apply a Velcro strap to the segments and squeeze them together a little bit, so that gives us enough clearance. And then more copious amounts of epoxy. Once the ring is in position, we can release the strap and the booster segments spring back. We then insert the 3D printed spacer again between the boosters, which helps push the segments into the ring even more. And then again, we use more electrical tape to cover up all of the joints so they don't drip, especially since some of them are upside down. Does that bit of tape bother you as much as it does me? Now we can attach the fins. We saw some of this footage in the previous episode, so we'll just show you a quick summary of the fin brackets being attached. This took 3 days to get all of them attached. Now that the entire booster is together and the central release mechanism is aligned with the booster, it's time to align the launch tubes with the booster segments. We always knew that we had to do this step and that the booster launch tubes will need some sort of wiggle room. We just didn't know by how much and in what directions we'd need to enlarge the holes. Filing soon gave way to a Dremel with a milling bit to enlarge the holes. These were pretty thick aluminium plates. We need the launch tubes to be able to move laterally a little bit as the booster expands under pressure. The nozzle seats have a very tight tolerance against the nozzles, so if they weren't allowed to move, they could wedge the whole rocket. This process took almost a whole day to get everything aligned exactly as we wanted. And here are the launch tubes fitted to the launcher and aligned with the nozzles on the booster. We made up a couple of rail buttons from some Delrin and aluminium. Because it's a pressure chamber, we can't screw them through the wall, so we need to surface mount them. This time though, we used a different glue. Nah, we didn't. It's the same epoxy as before. It's always the same epoxy. And here we're attaching the second one. Time to head outside and start doing a full integration test. This is the first time the entire booster has its fins and nose cones fitted. The idea of the integration test is to bring all the components together to see if things interfere with each other or if we've needed to add something perhaps that we've missed. One of the things we're also doing is double checking all of the connections, their seals, making sure that we have all of the tools we'll need at the launch site. Basically looking at all of the logistics of setting up the launcher and rocket out on the launch site. Here we're setting up the ramp. Now one thing we discovered that the ramp needs to be moved off center on the launcher because the booster itself is not symmetrically centered on the launcher. The whole ramp is adjustable so that we can exactly align the guide rail with the rail buttons, and also we have the release mechanism aligned with the rest of the booster. It turns out we got very lucky and the lower fin just ends up missing the side of the ramp. The next thing we discovered was that the release head in the release position was actually touching the inside of one of the booster segments. On release, it was possible that it would impact that pressurized segment and could cause some damage. So out comes the angle grinder, because of course when you make water rockets you need an angle grinder. Then it was time to fit the second stage to make sure that we can lock it into the stager properly with the current configuration. Here we're practicing raising the rocket to see where we need to hold it, and more importantly, what things are we going to trip over. This will be the procedure at the launch site. We'll raise the rocket first and then level the launcher to make sure that the rocket is pointing directly vertical. Then the rocket gets lowered to the arming position. In this position, we'll be able to arm all of the electronics and start the cameras. Then it's back all the way down to practice removing the booster from the launcher if we need to do an abort and take the booster off. And here we are back the next day to do the full wet dress rehearsal. We basically bring out everything required for the launch and hook it all up. Here we're practicing filling the rocket with water. We will have the water amounts measured out exactly in bottles so that we don't have to worry about that on launch day. This is the first time we're actually filling up the booster fully assembled. The ramp is sloping away from the launcher so that the water drains towards the top of the booster and not spill out. We also figured out that inserting the launch tubes into the nozzles individually is a lot easier than trying to get them all to go in at the same time along with the guide rail. The problem is that when the rocket is horizontal, they have a tendency to bend a little bit due to gravity and so don't quite slide into the nozzles as easily. Again, we have very high tolerances between the launch tubes and the nozzles. We can then slide the entire rocket onto the launcher and lock it into place. And then reconnect the hoses to each of the booster segments. Next we can put in the second stage. After it is inserted between the booster segments, we can also fill it with water. And then that gets locked into place. With all the water, the entire rocket now weighs about 20 kilograms, so it makes it a bit more of a handful when trying to lift it. And now with the scuba tanks and launch control box, there is even more of a trip hazard. Here you can also see where the shock cord will be attached. We're again checking to see if we're going to catch it on something or not. We've connected up all of the hoses and made sure we clearly labeled everything. Each O-ring was also checked at this point and we made sure we had spares for each of them. We also made up a diagram that labeled every single seal in the entire air distribution system. This way it would be a lot easier to fix one out in the field. We had a couple of inspectors come and visit to make sure we were compliant with color selection. We then spent a good hour and a half going through the entire procedure and creating what would become a 3-page checklist to get the launcher and rocket ready for flight. This ended up being extremely useful on launch day. Then we practiced again lowering the rocket, this time full of water in case we had to abort. When removing the rocket from the launcher, we leave the launch tubes attached to the launcher. Time to paint the booster. It took a bit of time to mask off everything properly. We decided to keep some of the carbon fiber flat sections in their natural black color. Here we're using spray putty again to coat everything. This helps to fill in the little divots left over from the cloth texture. Although it looks a little patchy here while it dries, it dried to an even coat. I think we ended up using about 1.5 cans of the putty, and we typically give it 2 to 3 coats. The nose cones and payload bay tubes get the same treatment with the spray putty. The paper tube inside the payload bay tubes stops any paint from coating the inside of the tubes, as these surfaces are needed to snugly fit together with other components. Once these are dry, about 2 hours later, we can add the top coat. Normally we would hit the spray putty with 400 grit sandpaper, but this time it looked like it was a fairly nice, even, smooth finish, and so we left it as is. This was done for a couple of reasons. It was a lot less work not having to sand everything, and it also provided an even undercoat for the top coat to go on. In the past, when we've sanded the putty back, we would end up with patchy texture revealing some of the darker carbon fibre underneath it. This then required more top coats to hide the patches. We're again painting the booster white for thermal control. The paint we are using for the top coat is Duramax Gloss Antique White. This paint has really good coverage and dries super fast. Because it dries so fast, you need to spray a slightly heavier coat to get a more shiny finish. If you just do thinner light coats, you end up with a more satin finish. You can handle the painted rocket within about an hour on a warm day. We ended up giving the booster about 2 to 3 coats of the paint. Time to remove the masking tape from all of the components. And here's the final booster painted. The rocket is now ready for flight. If you want to see it in action, click up here. The next video will have the full launch day operations with lots of camera angles, so stay tuned for that. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time. Here's a 3-hour time lapse of us just trying to align the booster with the release head.